Poor girl from an orphanage gets help from a young billionaire who pays for her education. Years later, he is left in a nursing home by his children. A nurse holds his hand and says, "Now it's my turn to take care of you," and he starts crying uncontrollably. Pineview Orphanage always carried that clean scent which never managed to fully hide the smell of abandonment. The walls, once painted a vibrant light green, were now faded, decorated with children's drawings hung with pride. But the forced cheerfulness of that place did not fool Anne. At 6 years old, Anne understood the world better than many adults. She knew that noise belonged to the chosen and silence belonged to the forgotten. And she had already chosen her side. That morning, while the other children shouted in the yard, Anne sat in the corner of the makeshift library, a wooden shelf holding donated books, most of them missing pages. It didn't matter. For her, each page was a portal to somewhere else. "They're coming today," murmured Mrs. Collins, the head of the orphanage, as she straightened the crooked tie of little Lucas. "I want everyone clean and well-behaved." It was visiting day, a day of hope for some, signs of disappointment for most. Anne never cared much for those days. At 6E, she was considered too old by couples looking for babies. She had learned not to expect much, to be content with the stories she found in those worn-out books. Today's book had a dragon on the cover. It wasn't a scary dragon, but one that looked sad, lonely. Anne ran her finger across the illustration as if she could comfort the creature. "What are you reading?" The voice caught Anne by surprise. No one ever asked what she was reading. No one ever noticed she read at all. She looked up, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. It was a tall man with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wasn't wearing a suit like the other visitors, just a simple blue shirt and dark pants. His eyes were kind, but tired. "It's about a dragon," Anne replied, her voice almost a whisper. "He guards a treasure, but he's all alone." The man smiled, crouching down to her level. "May I sit?" Anne nodded, sliding a bit to the side. She wasn't used to sharing her corner with anyone. "My name is Paul," he said, extending his hand formally, as though she were an adult. "Anne," she replied, shaking his hand with her tiny fingers. "Anne with an E at the end." She nodded, surprised he had noticed that detail. "I like to read too," Paul continued, glancing at the shelf. "Are there any good books here?" "Some," Anne shrugged. "This is the best. It talks about things that seem scary but aren't." Paul smiled again. That smile was different from the ones adults usually gave the children in the orphanage. There was no pity in it. "Mrs. Collins told me you're always reading." "Books don't lie," she simply replied. Paul remained silent for a moment, watching her with genuine interest. "And do you like school, Anne?" "I like learning. The teacher says I learn fast." The orphanage's bustle seemed distant now. In the corner of that tiny library, there was only a calm conversation between a 6-year-old girl and a man who genuinely seemed to care about what she had to say. "What do you want to be when you grow up, Anne?" It was a common question, but the way Paul asked it felt different, as though he really wanted to know, as if her answer mattered. Anne thought for a moment, closing the book and looking directly at him. "I want to take care of the people nobody wants to take care of." Paul blinked, visibly surprised. It wasn't the answer he was expecting. "Why?" "Because I know what it's like when nobody chooses you," she responded with a simplicity that masked the depth of her words. Something changed in Paul's eyes. He nodded slowly, as if he had just understood something important. "You'd have to study a lot for that." "I know, I will study." The sound of footsteps approached, and Mrs. Collins appeared with her professional smile. "Mr. Thompson, I see you've met our Anne. She's very quiet but very bright." Paul stood up, but his eyes remained on Anne. "Mrs. Collins, could we speak in private?" Anne watched the two adults walk away, feeling that familiar sensation of being left behind. She returned to her book, diving into the story of the solitary dragon. Minutes or hours later, Anne never had a good sense of time when she was reading. Mrs. Collins called her into the office. The small room had a noisy ceiling fan and stacks of paperwork covering the desk. Paul was seated in one of the chairs, looking strangely nervous. "Anne," began the director, wearing a larger-than-normal smile, "Mr. Thompson has a proposal for you." The girl looked at Paul curiously. It wasn't a hopeful look. Anne had learned not to hope, but one of genuine interest. "Anne," Paul said, leaning forward, "you said you want to take care of the people no one wants to take care of. For that, you'll need a good education." She nodded, serious. "I'd like to pay for your studies. A good school, where you can learn everything you need." Anne frowned, confused. No one gave anything for free in the world she knew. "Why?" Paul smiled at the direct question. "Because I believe you'll do something important one day, and because I've always wanted to help someone who truly deserves a chance." Anne looked at Mrs. Collins, who nodded, encouraging her. "I won't be leaving the orphanage." "Not now," Paul replied. "You'll still live here, but you'll attend a different school. And we'll get to know each other better over time, if you'd like." Anne considered the offer. It seemed too good to be true. "I only want one thing in return," Paul continued. "Ah," Anne thought. There was always a catch. "What?" "That one day, when you're able, you help someone else. Just like I'm trying to help you now. Can that be a promise?" The seriousness with which he made the request moved Anne. He wasn't an adult talking down to a child, but a person asking another for something important. "I promise," she said firmly, extending her small hand. Paul shook it, sealing a deal neither of them knew would change their lives. "It's settled then," he smiled. "You'll study, learn a lot, and one day you'll take care of those who need it." In that moment, in the stuffy office of any given orphanage, a promise was born that would span years. A promise made by a quiet girl who loved books and a wealthy man searching for something money couldn't buy. Anne didn't know what the future held. She didn't know the challenges she would face, the doors that would open, the roads she would cross. But she knew a promise was sacred. And Anne never broke promises. The navy blue uniform of Whitmore School weighed on Anne's shoulders, not because of the fabric, but because of what it represented. In those polished hallways, among the children of doctors and business owners, she was the orphanage girl, the one who didn't belong. Anne adjusted her backpack and raised her chin. She was 12 now, 6 years since that promise to Paul. 6 years of splitting her mornings between the worn orphanage and the pristine school. 2 worlds separated by a 20-minute drive, but as distant as different planets. "Hey, orphan, did you do the math homework? Can I copy it?" Tyler, with his grin that had never heard the word no, blocked her way. "I did, but I'm not letting you copy," Anne replied, stepping around him. "Come on. You should be grateful we let you hang out with us." Anne held her breath, counting to 10 in her mind. The words stung, but she had developed armor against them. In silence, she entered the classroom and took her usual seat in the second row, near the window. Miss Lawson walked in, carrying the characteristic smell of coffee and lavender. "Today we're going to talk about choices and consequences in literature," she announced, writing on the whiteboard. "Who can give me an example of a literary choice that changed the course of a story?" Anne's hand shot up automatically. Books had always been her safe territory. "Anne?" "In Jane Eyre, when Jane decides to leave Rochester after discovering his wife in the attic, she chooses integrity over love, and that defines the rest of the story." The teacher smiled, impressed. "Excellent example. Jane's moral choice shows how—" Miss Lawson's words were drowned out by a nasty whisper from behind. "Know-it-all. She only knows this because she doesn't have a family to distract her." Anne gripped her pencil tightly, but kept her eyes on the board. None of that mattered. What mattered was the promise, the future she was building word by word, grade by grade. After classes, while most students were picked up by private cars or nannies, Anne headed to the bus stop. The ride back to the orphanage was her transition time, bridging those 2 worlds. Mrs. Collins greeted her with her usual half-smile. "There's a letter for you." Anne took the envelope carefully. She recognized the handwriting immediately. The paper was good quality, but without ostentation, just like Paul. In the shared dorm, she sat on her bed, the only one personalized with a small improvised shelf full of books, gifts from Paul over the years. "Another letter from your mysterious benefactor?" asked Melissa, her roommate, without much interest. Anne nodded, opening the envelope gently. "Dear Anne, Your last letter brought me great joy. Your enthusiasm for literature is contagious. I'm proud of how you've seized every opportunity to learn. I spoke with Mrs. Collins about your idea to start a reading club at the orphanage. We agree it's a wonderful initiative. I'll send a few books to start with, and you can choose more next week. I know it's not always easy being different. Sometimes the loneliest path is also the most important. Stay strong, Anne. You have a greater purpose than they can see right now. With admiration, Paul Anne folded the letter and placed it in the special box under her bed, along with all the others. Each word from Paul was like a compass, guiding her through difficult days. She took out a sheet of paper and began to write her reply. Dear Paul, thank you for the books and for supporting the reading club. I already have 3 children interested. I want to start with stories about courage and overcoming obstacles. School is going well. I got the highest grade on my science project about stem cells. The teacher said I have a talent for medicine. I think more and more about becoming a doctor, maybe specializing in elderly care. They sometimes seem as forgotten as we are at the orphanage. Are you coming to visit me next week? I understand if you're busy. Your letters already mean so much. With gratitude, Anne. Years passed like that, letters crossing the distance between an orphanage and a billionaire's mansion. Rare but meaningful visits. With each encounter, Paul seemed a bit older, a bit more tired. But the look in his eyes when he saw Anne was the same, full of quiet pride. By age 15, Anne was no longer the shy girl in the corner of the library. She remained quiet and observant, but now she led the reading club, tutored the younger children, and stayed at the top of her class at Whitmore. Why do you work so hard? Asked Eliza, one of the few friends Anne had made at school. You're already the best student, Anne smiled, closing the advanced biology book she was studying. Because I made a promise. To the man who pays for your school. To myself, too. The dormitory became emptier over the years. Younger children were adopted. Some ran away, others turned 18 and left. Anne saw many goodbyes. In her last letter before final exams in high school, she wrote, Dear Paul, I'm studying for the tests as if my life depends on it. In a way, it does. Every equation, every formula, every literary analysis brings me closer to the person I want to become. I keep noticing how the weakest are forgotten. Last week, I volunteered at the public nursing home. The eyes of those elderly people. Paul, so many stories to tell and so few to listen. It reminded me of our first conversation. I remembered our promise. 17 and still at the orphanage. I was never chosen by a family, but I was chosen by you for a purpose. That's worth more than any adoption. I will study nursing. The decision is made. I want to be on the front line of care. I want to be the hands that comfort, the ears that listen. Your letter strengthens me as always. With affection and gratitude, Anne. Paul's response arrived a week later, along with a book about pioneering nurses. His handwriting seemed shakier, but his words remained steadfast. At her graduation, Anne looked through the crowd. Paul wasn't there, but he sent a bouquet of white lilies with a card. Proud of every step. Keep going. The orphanage, the school, the letters, the books, all of it formed the solid foundation on which Anne built her determination. Alone, yet never completely. Steadfast, forged as much by absence as by the distant yet constant presence of Paul. And she kept going. The final year of high school arrived at breakneck speed. Anne, now 18, felt the weight of all the decisions she had to make. The calendar on the dorm wall was marked in red circles around college application dates and scholarship deadlines. Have you sent out all the forms? Asked Mrs. Collins, handing Anne a cup of tea as she pored over books and papers on the communal table at the orphanage. Almost, Anne replied, rubbing her tired eyes. I'm still finalizing the essay for the Florence Nightingale Scholarship. Mrs. Collins smiled. Even after all these years, she was still amazed at how that once silent girl had become such a focused and resilient young woman. That scholarship is very competitive, isn't it? Extremely. It offers full coverage for nursing school and includes an internship at University Hospital, Anne explained, not taking her eyes off the paper. My essay needs to be perfect. If anyone can do it, it's you, Mrs. Collins said. giving Anne's shoulder a supportive squeeze before leaving. Anne turned back to her essay. The theme was why I chose to care. A simple question on the surface, but one loaded with the weight of her entire story. Hours passed. The orphanage gradually fell silent. The younger kids were already in bed, and only the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the stillness. Anne wrote and rewrote every paragraph. She didn't mention the orphanage directly, nor the lack of a family. Instead, she spoke of eyes that remain unseen, voices unheard, and how a nurse's hands can be a patient's last human connection if they feel invisible. She thought of Paul as she wrote, of how he had seen her when no one else did, of how he had believed in her when she was just a quiet little girl with a book in her hands. When she finished, it was past midnight. She read the essay one last time, made a few minor corrections, and placed it in a carefully labeled folder. Tomorrow she would mail everything. Before sleeping, she wrote a short note to Paul, mentioning the scholarship and her essay. It was only a quick update, with a promise of more details in her next letter. The following weeks were torture by waiting. Anne kept up her routine, school, studying, volunteering at the public nursing home on Saturdays, but her thoughts constantly returned to the scholarship. "You'll get it," said Eliza, her school friend, during lunch. "Your grades are perfect, and you already have practical experience with the elderly at the nursing home." "There are many qualified applicants," Anne always replied, cautious not to have high expectations. "None with your story," Eliza insisted. Anne smiled but didn't argue. Her story wasn't something she liked to use as a trump card. It was something she carried quietly, like a closed book only she and Paul in his letters truly opened. It was on a random Thursday that the letter arrived. Anne recognized the university crest on the envelope immediately. Her hands trembled so badly she almost couldn't open it. "Dear Miss Anne Lawson, we are pleased to inform you that your application for the Florence Nightingale Scholarship has been approved." The words danced before her eyes. Approved. College. Nursing. Dream. Reality. "I did it," she whispered to herself, barely believing. The news spread through the orphanage like wildfire. Mrs. Collins organized a small celebration with cake and soda. The younger children looked at Anne with a mixture of awe and confusion, not fully grasping why there was a party. "To our star," Mrs. Collins toasted, raising her glass of soda. The first from Pineview Orphanage to get a full scholarship to university. There were cheers and smiles. Anne thanked them shyly, uncomfortable being the center of attention. But inside, her heart overflowed with calm, solid happiness, the certainty of a path. That night, after the small party ended and she was finally alone, Anne wrote the most important letter she had ever written. "Dear Paul, today I received the news I was hoping for. I got the Florence Nightingale Scholarship in nursing, full coverage, plus an internship at the university hospital. I start next semester. It feels strange to write those words and realize they're real, that it's not just a dream or a plan, but my immediate future, a future that only exists because of you." I remember that first conversation in the orphanage library. I was a 6-year-old clutching a book about a dragon. You were a stranger who cared enough to ask what I wanted to be. "I want to care for the people nobody wants to care for," I told you. 12 years have gone by. The road wasn't easy. There were days I doubted, days I felt completely alone. But your letters and your faith in me kept me going. Now, I'm one step away from fulfilling what I promised. I will care for those who are forgotten, just like you cared for me. How do I thank you for something as big as a transformed life? I don't have enough words. Maybe the best way is to honor your trust every day, with each patient I care for, each life I touch. You didn't just pay for my education. You taught me that being truly seen is a gift we can offer others. That's what I want to do with my life. With eternal gratitude, Anne. She sealed the envelope carefully. After mailing it the following morning, she sat on the edge of her bed looking at the calendar. In a few months, she would be leaving that orphanage. A strange mix of relief and apprehension washed over her. Those walls had been both her prison and her refuge. There, she had been the girl nobody chose to adopt, but also the girl who chose her own path. The letter arrived at the Thompson mansion on a sunny Tuesday. Paul was in his office, reviewing documents, when his assistant knocked softly on the door. "Sir, a letter has arrived from Miss Anne." He smiled immediately, putting the pen aside. Anne's letters were always a welcome break in his increasingly busy days. Her handwriting had changed over the years, becoming firmer and more defined, just like her. Paul opened the envelope gently, never tearing it as he always did. As he read, his tired eyes lit up. Reaching the line, "I will care for the forgotten, just as you cared for me," he had to stop. An unexpected emotion took hold of him, forming a lump in his throat. How long had it been since someone made him feel something like this? This pure pride, untainted by ulterior motives. His own children had taken different paths, more concerned with the family fortune than with the legacy of his work. But here was Anne, a girl who had nothing, turning this opportunity into something beautiful and meaningful. Paul reread the letter multiple times before carefully folding it and placing it into the special drawer of his desk, where he kept all of Anne's letters, organized by date. That folder contained more than letters. It held the story of a fulfilled promise, proof that some decisions, even small and impulsive, can change entire lives. Paul smiled, closing the drawer. One choice, made 12 years ago, continued to bear fruit, and that, he thought, might be the most valuable investment he had ever made in his life. Time takes no prisoners. This fact became clearer to Paul every morning, when his knees protested as he got out of bed, or when it took him a few seconds to remember where he had left his glasses. 78 years was no joke. The Thompson mansion, once a symbol of power and success, now seemed too large and far too empty. Footsteps echoed on the marble floors, and conversation was rare. Sometimes, Paul went entire days without speaking to anyone except Margaret, his longtime housekeeper, and his personal assistant. Anne's letters were his beacon of light. She was now in her second year of nursing school, and each letter was filled with stories of lessons, challenges overcome, and her ever-growing passion for patient care. Paul smiled, taking a sip of coffee while rereading her latest letter. Anne had started an internship in geriatrics and mentioned an elderly patient who refused medication until she promised to listen to his wartime stories. "Mr. Thompson, your children have arrived." Margaret's voice interrupted his thoughts. He slid the letter back into the drawer and composed himself, feeling the familiar knot in his stomach that always accompanied visits from Richard and Elizabeth. "Send them in." Richard came first, displaying his usual impeccable suit and an excessively expensive watch. Elizabeth followed, scrolling through her phone and barely lifting her eyes to greet her father. "Dad Gowers, how are you feeling?" Richard asked, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. "Fine, the usual," Paul replied, noticing how his son avoided direct eye contact. "We got a call from Dr. Morris." Elizabeth finally stowed her phone away. "Why didn't you tell us about the test results?" Paul sighed. The doctor had found some cardiac irregularities. "Nothing dramatic, but worth monitoring. I didn't want to worry you, they're just routine checkups. Dad, you're 78 and living alone in this huge mansion. They're not just routine." Richard used the tone he reserved for business negotiations, the tone of someone who had already decided and was only making an announcement. "We need to discuss your future care." "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," Paul replied, feeling a surge of irritation. "Margaret is here, and I have Dr. Morris for regular consultations." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with her brother, the kind that made Paul feel like a child being discussed by adults. "We found an option we think you'll like," she said, pulling a brochure from her bag. "Cedarwood Residence, the best senior living facility in the city." Paul took the brochure without really looking at it. A care home. His children wanted to put him in a care home. "I don't need that, I'm fine here." "Dad, be reasonable." Richard used his negotiation voice again. "Your health is starting to fail. The house is too large to maintain properly, and frankly, keeping all this up is a waste of money." Ah, Paul thought, the money. It always came back to that. What would happen to the house, he asked, already knowing the answer. "We could sell it, invest the proceeds wisely to ensure your future comfort," Richard replied promptly, as though rehearsed. And your own present comfort, Paul thought. The mansion was worth millions. I need to think, he said at last. Of course, Elizabeth smiled, though her eyes remained cold. But don't take too long. They have a waiting list. The conversation shifted to shallow small talk. Richard's new project, Elizabeth's trip to Europe. No one asked how Paul really was, about his days, his thoughts. It was as though he were already a ghost, an inconvenient presence, occupying space and resources until he finally left. After his children left, Paul sat in silence for a long time. At some point, he recalled a line from Anne's last letter. The saddest thing isn't when elderly patients feel physical pain, but when they realize they've become invisible to the world. He understood that now. It wasn't his weakening heart that hurt the most. It was the indifference disguised as concern. In the weeks that followed, the pressure mounted. Daily calls. Surprise visits from Dr. Morris, clearly influenced by Richard. Subtle comments from Elizabeth about how the housekeeper wasn't managing the cleaning properly. Then came the incident that decided everything. One morning, while descending the stairs, Paul felt a sudden dizziness. He grabbed the railing, but his legs gave out. When he woke, he was in the hospital, tubes and monitors around him. A transient ischemic attack, Dr. Morris explained. A warning from your body, Mr. Thompson. Richard and Elizabeth used the incident as the ultimate argument. Papers were signed, decisions made. Paul felt like a spectator to his own life. A week later, he was settled at Alameda residence. His room was spacious, overlooking a meticulously kept garden. The bed was comfortable, the meals were well prepared, everything was elegant, discreet, and impersonal. You'll love it here, the director promised during the tour. We have daily activities, a library, a game room. Many residents build lasting friendships. Paul smiled politely, but his eyes registered something else. The vacant stares of elderly people in wheelchairs in the hallway. Nurses, too, rushed to really see the people they cared for, family members checking the time during their visits. In the days that followed, a routine was established. Breakfast at 8 a.m., medications at 9, physical therapy at 10, lunch at noon, rest time. Group activities he avoided. Dinner, TV, sleep. Richard and Elizabeth's visits gradually diminished, first weekly, then bi-weekly, then monthly. Always brief, always with excuses about important commitments. Paul realized he had become an item on their to-do list, an obligation, not a desire. In his third month at Alameda, Paul sat at the small desk in his room trying to write to Anne. The words wouldn't come. How could he tell her he had become exactly the kind of person she was preparing to care for? How to admit that, despite all his money and power, he'd ended up as alone as she was in the orphanage? The paper remained blank. He wrote and erased, tried again. Nothing seemed right. Anne's letters kept arriving regularly. He read them eagerly, but his replies became shorter, vaguer. He didn't mention moving to the care home. He didn't talk about the loneliness consuming him. Mr. Thompson, it's time for your medication, an aide announced, entering without knocking. Paul put the unfinished letter in the drawer. Maybe tomorrow he would find the right words. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The silence grew. Not the external silence. Alameda was full of artificial sounds. TVs turned up loud for the hard of hearing. Announcements over the PA system forced small talk between staff and residents. It was an internal silence. The silence of someone who no longer expects to be truly heard, of someone who no longer sees any point in speaking. Anne's letters now went straight into the drawer, some still unopened. Each one was a painful reminder of a life with meaning, of a promise made and kept. While he, Paul Thompson, the philanthropist who had changed an orphan girl's life, couldn't even change his own reality. At dinner, he ate alone, watching other residents. Some had occasional visits, obligated children, bored grandchildren. Others, like him, ate in silence, their eyes lost in memories no one else could see. "May I sit here?" asked a neatly coiffed white-haired lady. Paul nodded out of courtesy, not out of a desire for company. "I'm Martha. I've been here 5 years," she introduced herself, "and you're the new man, the reclusive billionaire, so they say." He offered a faint smile. Just an old man now." "We all are," she replied with refreshing honesty. "The trick is not to let them know. Them. Those who put us here and went on with their lives. Those who think comfort is the same as care." Paul felt an unexpected connection with Martha, but even that small spark of humanity seemed too little, too late, against the emptiness growing inside him. At night, lying in a perfectly soft bed in a perfectly adequate room, Paul Thompson, the man who had built an empire and helped shape the destiny of an orphan girl, felt more invisible than he had ever been. Silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of purpose. The university campus buzzed with the typical excitement of a new semester. Freshmen got lost with campus maps in hand. Upperclassmen gathered in loud groups. Professors hurried by with folders and laptops. Anne walked among them with firm, determined steps, her crisp white nursing coat bearing the badge of the School of Nursing. Junior year. In just a few more months, she'd start her final clinical rotation, the last major step before graduation. Anxiety and anticipation mixed in her chest as she entered the Health Sciences building. "Anne, saved you a seat," called Megan, a classmate, waving from a central row in the lecture hall. Anne smiled and joined her friend. The room was filling up for the first class of advanced geriatric care, one of Anne's most important courses. As she arranged her notebook and pens, her fingers touched a folded envelope in her coat pocket, a letter from Paul she always carried with her, not the most recent. Actually, it was over 2 years old, but one whose words Anne revisited whenever she felt uncertain. Professor Daniels entered, breaking her thoughts. He was a serious-looking man with grey hair, known for his strictness and expertise. "Good morning. Advanced geriatric care is not just a subject, it's a philosophy," he began, peering over his glasses. "You won't be treating diseases alone. You'll be dealing with entire lives contained within frail bodies." Anne straightened in her chair, fully absorbed. Every word echoed something that already lived within her. "The biggest mistake you can make is seeing only the frailty, not the strength in each elderly patient." Anne smiled slightly. In one of Paul's earliest letters to her, when she was still a teenager at the orphanage, he had written something similar. "True strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up each time, even when the body no longer obeys as quickly." The class continued with the professor outlining the specific challenges of geriatric care. Anne took meticulous notes, though her mind occasionally drifted to Paul's words, as though the two voices, her teachers and her distant mentors, were conversing, complementing each other. After class, Anne headed to the library. She had 2 hours before her next commitment and intended to get some reading done. She found a quiet spot by a window overlooking a small garden of cherry trees. Before opening her textbooks, she allowed herself a moment. She took the folded letter from her pocket and read it again, even though she already knew every word by heart. "Dear Anne, your story about the difficulties with Mr. Jenkins touched me deeply. Always remember, behind every resistance lies an untold story, an unspoken fear. When I built my first business, I faced a particularly tough competitor. Instead of confronting him head-on, I invited him for coffee. I discovered his father had lost everything to a dishonest partner. His hostile behavior was simply fear in disguise. In nursing, especially geriatric nursing, you'll find many forms of resistance. Look beyond them. Ask yourself, what is this person protecting? What are they afraid of? True care begins when we see the invisible." With admiration for your path, Paul Anne refolded the letter and put it away. It was amazing how Paul's words took on new meanings as she advanced in her studies, like he somehow knew exactly what she would need in the future. Paul's replies had become shorter in recent months. Anne attributed it to his age, perhaps some health issue he didn't want to mention. She maintained her regular letters, sharing her academic progress, interesting patients, and the challenges she overcame. She opened her geriatric textbook, but her mind kept returning to Paul's words. There had been so many lessons over the years, so much advice that shaped not just her education but her character. She recalled being 15 and writing to him about the bullying she faced at the private school. Paul hadn't offered easy solutions or cliches. Instead, He told her about his own experience of rejection when he started out as a young entrepreneur without any connections in a world of privilege. The difference between being defeated and learning from defeat lies in what you choose to observe, others or yourself, he wrote, or the time she doubted whether to choose nursing over medicine, afraid she might make the wrong choice. There's no perfect path, Anne. There's the path that resonates with who you are. Medicine heals diseases. Nursing cares for people. Both are noble. The question is, which one speaks to your heart? Anne smiled at the memory. It was so clear now that nursing was her calling, hands-on care, noticing details doctors often didn't have time to see, listening to the stories between the complaints. Studying hard? Derek's voice, a classmate from her study group, pulled her back to the present. He placed a cup of coffee on the table and took a seat across from her. Always, Anne replied with a grin. You've got that look again, he commented, a million miles away. Just thinking. About your application for the internship at St. Mary's Geriatric Centre. Anne nodded. St. Mary's was one of the top geriatric care centres in the country. Landing an internship there would open many doors. You'll get it, Derek assured her. No one is more dedicated than you. Anne thanked him but knew it wasn't just dedication driving her. There was a deeper purpose, fueled by every letter, every piece of advice, and every show of faith Paul had given her. That night, in her small rented apartment, her first real home after leaving the orphanage, Anne was organizing her special box of correspondence. Every letter from Paul, from the first to the most recent, was there, arranged chronologically. The collection formed a sort of shared autobiography, the story of a silent girl growing into a determined woman, guided by the words of a man who saw potential where others saw only a futureless orphan. Anne set aside a few specific letters containing advice on geriatric care. She planned to review them before her interview at St. Mary's the following week. It was curious how Paul, despite not being a doctor, had such precise insights into caring for the elderly. When we grow old, what we fear most isn't pain, but being forgotten, not being seen, not being heard. Remember this when caring for your elderly patients, one of the letters said. Those words now seemed almost prophetic for her chosen career. Anne sat at her small desk to write her weekly letter to Paul. She told him about Professor Daniels, the internship application, and an article she was writing for the college newspaper about dignity in elderly care. At the end, she added, "The words you wrote to me so many years ago are still alive inside me, guiding my every choice, every caring gesture. Sometimes it's when I have a difficult patient, I ask myself, what would Paul say here? And I almost always find the answer in one of your letters. I hope you're doing well. Your last letters have been shorter, which I understand if you're busy or tired. Just know that even when your words are few, your impact on my life remains immense. I will always be grateful for the path you helped me find. Affectionately, Anne." She sealed the envelope, already knowing she would mail it the next day to the Thompson mansion. She didn't know her words now traveled further still, rerouted from the empty mansion to a private room in an upscale care home, where a lonely man received them like drops of water in a desert. On the eve of her internship interview, Anne couldn't sleep. Anxiety kept her awake, causing her to question her preparation, her abilities. She got up and went to the box of letters. She searched for a specific one, written before her high school final exams. She found it almost immediately, as if her hands had a memory of their own. Doubt is just fear disguised as intelligence. Use it to prepare better, not to sabotage yourself, Paul had written. Anne took a deep breath, feeling the words calm her racing mind. That's what Paul's letters did. They anchored her in turbulent moments, serving as a compass when the path seemed unclear. His words stayed with her, not just on paper but inside her, merging with her own thoughts, becoming part of who she was and who she was becoming. Holding on to those words in her heart, Anne fell asleep, ready for another step toward the promise she had made so many years ago. The university auditorium was filled with formally dressed people. Anne adjusted her graduation cap one last time and took a deep breath. 4 years of intense study were culminating in this moment. Anne Lawson, the dean announced. She walked to the center of the stage with steady steps. Receiving her diploma, she scanned the crowd instinctively. though she knew Paul wouldn't be there. He had sent a letter explaining a business trip would prevent his attendance. Instead, she saw Mrs. Collins, now fully grey-haired, smiling from the third row. "He would be so proud," Mrs. Collins said after the ceremony, hugging Anne with surprising strength. The celebration dinner was simple, just a few close classmates and Mrs. Collins. There was no large extended family or parents taking photos, but there was a sense of achievement no one could take away. In the following days, Anne arranged her future. St. Mary's Geriatric Centre, where she had interned, offered her a position. It was an excellent opportunity, a renowned institution with a good salary and respected staff. But something felt off. In her apartment, surrounded by moving boxes, Anne reread Paul's letters. His words about dignity and seeing people where others saw only patience echoed in her mind. St. Mary's was top-notch, but also exclusive, only accessible to those who could pay. The following week, Anne visited Pineview Care Home, a less luxurious elderly facility in a middle-class neighborhood. The place felt cozy despite its visible wear and tear. "Honestly, Miss Lawson, we're surprised by your interest," the director said during the interview. "With your resume, you could work at any major hospital." Anne smiled. "I believe dignified care should be available to everyone, not just those who can afford luxury." It was true, but not the only reason. During her visits to different facilities, Anne noticed the lonely gazes of Pineview's residents, the lack of individualized attention. In those gazes, she recognized the same abandonment she had once felt at the orphanage. "Are you crazy?" exclaimed Derek, her classmate, when she told him of her decision to accept Pineview's offer. "St. Mary's is every geriatric nurse's dream. Pineview needs me more," she simply responded. On her first day, Anne arrived an hour early to get a feel for the place. In the garden, she found an elderly lady watching her closely. "You must be the new nurse," the lady said. "You're early." "Yes, I'm Anne. And you are?" Ruth Calloway. "I've been here 3 years, ever since my children decided I was too big a burden." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a statement. Anne sat down beside her. "What brought you here, Anne? You seem too young and too qualified for this forgotten place." "I want to care for the people who need to be seen," Anne answered honestly. Ruth nodded, as though she understood more than Anne had said. "Well, there are plenty of invisible folks here." In the weeks that followed, Anne immersed herself fully in her new job. She learned every resident's name, their stories, their preferences. She introduced small changes, a system recording each resident's likes for the staff to reference, incorporating moments of conversation into medication rounds, a weekly reading club. "You're transforming this place," Ruth observed while Anne helped her with physical therapy exercises. "I'm just doing my job," Anne replied humbly. "No, you're doing more than your job. You're giving us back our humanity." The words touched Anne deeply. This was exactly what she had promised to do, so many years ago in the orphanage library. In her free time, she continued writing to Paul, sending the letters to Thompson Mansion. She received the occasional reply, brief, almost formal, so unlike the warm letters she was used to. Something was wrong, she could feel it, but without knowing where Paul was or what had happened, all she could do was continue her work, honoring the promise. 3 months after Anne started at Pineview, she was called to the director's office. "We have a situation," the director explained. "Alameda residence is undergoing emergency renovations. They need to transfer some residents temporarily, and they've asked us to take 5 of them." Anne knew Alameda only by reputation, one of the most exclusive facilities in the city. "When are they arriving?" she asked, already thinking about logistics. "Tomorrow. And since you've stood out so much here, I'd like you to be the nurse in charge of them." Anne nodded, accepting the added responsibility. That night, reviewing the preliminary charts of the new residents, she had no idea fate was about to close a circle that began with a promise made by a 6-year-old girl to a man who had seen beyond her loneliness. Morning at Pineview Care Home started with an unusual buzz. Staff hurried around preparing 5 rooms for the Alameda residents. Anne checked each detail: bed heights, emergency call buttons, chairs positioned to facilitate mobility. Nothing could be overlooked. Nurse Lawson, the preliminary charts have arrived, the administrative assistant said, handing over a folder. The patients will be here in an hour. Anne thanked her, sat down and began studying the cases. She wanted to be ready to receive each resident properly. The first 4 charts followed a familiar pattern among upper-class elderly, chronic conditions well controlled with expensive medications, histories of high-quality elective procedures, specialized diets. When she opened the 5th chart, the world stood still. Name: Paul Thompson. Age: 83. Condition: stable after transient ischemic episode. Reduced mobility. Occasional confusion episodes. The attached photo showed an aged face, thinner and more frail than in her memories, but unmistakable. The same eyes that had looked at a lonely girl clutching a dragon book decades earlier. Anne felt the air leave her lungs. A buzzing filled her ears as shock coursed through her body. Paul, her Paul, in a care home. Temporarily transferred to Pineview, under her care. Anne? Are you all right? Her supervisor's voice sounded distant. Yes, she managed, forcing herself back to reality, just mentally preparing. But her mind raced with questions. Why was Paul in a care home? Since when? Why had he never mentioned it in his letters, which had continued to arrive, though briefer and more formal? There was no time to process the whirlwind of emotions. The sound of ambulances arriving signaled the arrival of Alameda's residents. Anne took a deep breath, steadied her uniform, and walked to the entrance, determined to remain professional while her heart pounded wildly. The first 3 residents arrived together, accompanied by an Alameda nurse with detailed instructions. The 4th, a 90-year-old lady with moderate dementia, came with her anxious daughter, who repeated her mother's preferences and habits. Anne managed each admission with mechanical efficiency, while her eyes constantly darted to the entrance, expecting Paul's arrival. The last resident is coming separately, the Alameda nurse explained. He had elevated blood pressure during prep, nothing serious, but the doctor preferred monitored transport. Every minute of waiting felt like torture. Anne checked and rechecked room 17, prepared for Paul, adjusting the bed height, placing a copy of The Little Prince on the nightstand. He had once mentioned the book fondly in a letter. When the final ambulance finally arrived, Anne forced herself to walk, not run, to the door. Paramedics carefully unloaded a stretcher with an elderly man partially covered by a blue hospital sheet. Paul Thompson, 83, one of the paramedics reported, handing over the transfer sheet. Blood pressure stabilized during transport. Conscious but drowsy from anti-anxiety meds. Anne nodded, speechless, her eyes locked on Paul's face. Time had been cruel to him. Skin once firm, now lined with deep wrinkles, age spots freckling his hands, hair now completely white and thinning. But those eyes, though half closed by medication, were the same that had looked at her kindly and with genuine interest when no one else had. "We'll take him straight to room 17, she finally said, her professional tone masking her internal storm. "Everything's ready." She guided the transfer in silence, watching every detail as Paul was moved from the stretcher to the hospital bed. She checked his vitals methodically, recorded the parameters, adjusted the IV drip. When the paramedics left, Anne allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Alone in the room with Paul, who slept under the medication's influence, she felt silent tears roll down her cheeks. "Paul," she whispered, her hand hovering over his without touching. "What happened to you?" There was no answer, only the steady breathing of medicated sleep. Anne quickly composed herself at the sound of approaching footsteps. The care home's routine went on, and she had responsibilities to all residents, not just Paul. Throughout that first day, Anne split her time between her normal duties and frequent visits to room 17. Each time she checked on him, she hoped he would awaken, fearing and longing for the moment his eyes would open. It happened in the early evening. Anne was taking his vitals when she noticed a change in his breathing. Paul's eyes opened slowly, disoriented. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, confused. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," Anne said, using the professional tone she had rehearsed in her mind. "You're at Pineview Care Home. Alameda is under renovation, so you'll stay here for a while. I'm Nurse Lawson, responsible for your care. Paul blinked several times, trying to focus. His eyes roamed her face without recognition. Alameda, he repeated slowly. Yes, my children left me there. Anne's heart clenched at the resignation in his voice. She wanted to say, I'm Anne, the orphan girl, remember? But something held her back. Paul seemed fragile, disoriented by the sudden change and the medication. It wasn't the right time. Do you need anything? Water? Are you in pain? Paul shook his head slowly. Just confused. That's normal after medication and the change of environment. You'll adjust gradually. She adjusted the pillow gently, trying to ignore the storm of emotions inside her. This man, who had once been her pillar, her guide through wise and caring letters, now seemed lost, diminished. Rest, Mr. Thompson. I'll be around if you need anything. Anne left the room with controlled steps, leaning against the hallway wall once the door was closed, breathing deeply, trying to gather her thoughts. Should she reveal her identity now? Or would that be too great a shock for someone already vulnerable from relocation and possible cognitive issues? He didn't recognize you, did he? The voice of Ruth, the elderly resident who had become Anne's friend, came from a bench in the corridor. How do you know? Anne asked, startled. I'm 87, dear. I can tell when someone has just seen a ghost. Anne sat beside her, suddenly exhausted. It's him, Ruth, the man who changed my life. He paid for my education since I was 6. And now, he doesn't even know who I am. Ruth took her hand with wrinkled yet surprisingly strong fingers. What are you going to do? I don't know, Anne admitted. Part of me wants to run in there and say who I am. Another part worries it might be too much for him right now. We older folks, Ruth said thoughtfully, sometimes we need time. The memories are there, but they're buried, like seeds waiting for spring. Anne nodded, absorbing the wisdom in her simple words. I'll wait for the right moment, she decided. In the following days, Anne discreetly rearranged her schedule so she could be present for Paul's care whenever possible. She learned his new routine, how he preferred the pillow higher in the morning, lower at night, how he was more alert after the 10 a.m. tea, how his confusion increased in the early evening, a phenomenon known as sundowning. Without ever mentioning their shared past, Anne wove small details into his daily care. The chamomile tea with honey he'd once said he loved, the classical music he enjoyed while working, even the way he liked items arranged on the bedside table, as he once described in a letter about his meticulous organization. You seem to know exactly what I like, Paul remarked one morning, 2 weeks into his stay at Pineview. His condition had improved significantly. He was more alert, taking short walks with support, occasionally joining group activities. It's my job to notice what patients prefer, Anne replied with a smile. No, he insisted, looking at her more closely. It's different. Like, you know me. Anne felt her heart race. Maybe I just pay more attention than others. Paul studied her for a long moment. There's something familiar about you, he finally said. I can't quite place it. Anne straightened the sheets unnecessarily, hiding her emotions. Rest now, Mr. Thompson. It'll be time for physiotherapy soon. As the weeks passed, Paul thrived under Anne's attentive care. The medical team noted the surprising progress in his mobility, cognition, and overall disposition, exceeding expectations for someone his age and condition. What are you doing with him? Asked the attending physician during a staff meeting. I've never seen such a quick recovery in so short a time. Anne shrugged modestly, just individualized attention. What she didn't mention was how she researched every detail of his condition in her free time, adapted targeted rehab techniques for his case, and carefully chose readings and activities she knew, from his letters, would stimulate his mind without frustrating him. In her personal journal, Anne wrote about the strange role reversal life had orchestrated. Years ago, one of Paul's letters arrived at a critical moment during college, advising, "Remember, Anne, that true care is not just technical, but genuinely human. See who the patient really is, not just their condition." Now she applied that advice daily, caring for the very man who had written it. The question of when to reveal her identity haunted her constantly. Each little breakthrough, she wondered if it was the right moment. When he walked the hallway unaided, when he joined a literary discussion in the reading club, when he recalled events from decades ago with clarity. "Why do you wait?" Ruth asked one night, while the two shared tea in the staff lounge after a shift. "I'm afraid it will be too big a shock," Anne admitted. "And maybe I'm scared he'll feel diminished. In my memories, he was always so strong, so independent." Ruth shook her head. "Are you worried for him or for yourself? Maybe you're afraid to find out the hero of your childhood is just a frail old man now." The words hit Anne deeply because they held a truth she hadn't admitted. Part of her feared the revelation would change something fundamental about her bond with Paul, that the reversed power dynamic of her as caretaker and him as patient might somehow lessen all they had shared. "He deserves to know," Ruth added gently. "He deserves the chance to see how his faith in you has been rewarded." Anne nodded slowly. Ruth was right. She couldn't keep this secret out of fear. The next morning, she found Paul sitting by the window in his room, watching the care home's garden where some residents enjoyed the mild sun. He looked stronger, more present than he had since arriving. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she greeted, carrying his medication tray. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," he replied, turning to face her. "More like myself." Anne smiled, feeling a decision take shape. "How about some fresh air in the garden after breakfast?" "It's a perfect day out there." "I'd love that," Paul answered with enthusiasm that warmed Anne's heart. She nodded, resolute. It would be in the garden, then, in the sunlight, away from the institution's walls. She would tell Paul who she really was. She would reveal that the orphan girl he had once helped was now the one caring for him. The circle would finally close. Morning dawned crystal clear, as though the universe conspired to make the day special. Pine View's garden, usually simple, looked oddly beautiful under the golden light filtering through the leaves of old trees. Anne woke earlier than usual, spending extra time getting ready. In her uniform pocket, she placed the first letter Paul had ever sent her, now yellowed with age, a sort of talisman for the moment at hand. When she reached Paul's room, he was already up, sitting on the bed's edge, gazing at the sunlight pouring into the garden. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Anne smiled. "Ready for our time in the sun?" Paul turned to her, his eyes clearer and more alert than they'd been in weeks. "More than ready, Nurse Lawson. This room knows me all too well by now." Anne helped him stand, offering support as he balanced with his cane. His steps were steadier now, the result of weeks of attentive care and physical therapy. The walk to the garden was slow but steady. Paul insisted on walking on his own when possible, using the cane with determination. Anne stayed close by, watchful yet not intrusive, giving him the dignity of independence. They chose a bench partially shaded by an old magnolia tree. From there, they could watch other residents enjoying the day, some in small groups chatting, others simply soaking up the sun. "It's a lovely day," Paul commented, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. "Yes, it is," Anne agreed, her heart pounding in anticipation of what she was about to do. They sat quietly for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that exists only between people who share a deep connection, even if only one of them was aware of it. "You know," Paul finally broke the silence, his voice gentle and contemplative. "Since coming here, I've been dreaming about a library." Anne felt a shiver run down her spine. "A library?" "Yes, a small one, with dark wooden shelves, and a little girl, a very quiet girl with a dragon book." He frowned, concentrating. "It's strange how some memories return so vividly, while others stay out of reach." Anne exhaled slowly, sensing that the moment had arrived naturally without forcing. "Mr. Thompson, Paul," she began, her voice unsteady. "That's not just a memory. It's real." Paul turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" "The library. The girl with the dragon book." Anne paused, mustering courage. "That was me." Time seemed to freeze between them. Paul stared at her, his eyes scanning every detail of her face, as if trying to see through the decades separating them from that first meeting. "It can't be," he finally whispered. Anne pulled the yellowed letter from her pocket and carefully unfolded it. "This was the first letter you ever sent me. I was 6 years old and had just promised that one day I would help someone. the way you were helping me." Paul looked at the paper in her hands, at the handwriting he recognized as his own, much firmer back then. His eyes moved over the words, a spark of recognition beginning to glow. Suddenly, he reached out and grasped her hand. His fingers, though aged and marked by time, held surprising strength. "You're different. Have we met before?" There was urgency in his voice, as though part of him already knew the answer but needed to hear it out loud. Anne could no longer hold back her tears. "I'm Anne, the little girl from the orphanage. You paid for my education. Now it's my turn to take care of you." Paul's face crumpled, decades of self-control collapsing in seconds. Silent tears flowed as he gripped Anne's hand like a lifeline in a turbulent sea. "Anne," he repeated, the word heavy with recognition and emotion. "My Anne." He raised a trembling hand and gently touched her cheek, as if verifying she was real and not a product of his aging mind. "All this time," he murmured, "you've been here all this time, taking care of me, and I didn't recognize you. The important thing is that we found each other again," Anne said softly, tears streaming down her face. Paul shook his head, visibly moved. "My letters. I stopped replying properly when I moved to Alameda. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me like this. Diminished, dependent." "You will never be diminished in my eyes," Anne answered resolutely. "What you did for me no one else would have done. No. You changed my life when you chose to believe in a lonely little girl in an orphanage." For a few moments, words felt inadequate. Sitting side by side on that garden bench, their hands entwined, they simply existed in mutual recognition, in the perfect circle life had drawn, bringing them back together in reversed roles. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Paul finally spoke. "How promises can guide us through an entire lifetime." Anne nodded, recalling the promise made so long ago in the orphanage library. "Promises and scars," she said softly. "They're the invisible marks that shape us." In the weeks following that recognition in the garden, something fundamental changed between Anne and Paul. They were no longer just nurse and patient, nor benefactor and protege. They were two souls bound by a shared story, a connection that defied conventional definitions. Paul blossomed in a way that amazed Pineview's entire medical team. His cognition greatly improved, his mobility advanced beyond expectations, and his general disposition transformed. The taciturn, resigned man turned into someone engaged and present. "It's remarkable," said Dr. Garcia during a team meeting. "Every indicator for Mr. Thompson has improved in practically all areas. What changed in his treatment?" Anne gave a discreet smile. What had changed was not the medical treatment, but something more fundamental. Paul had rediscovered his sense of purpose. Now that there was no need to hide her identity, Anne began bringing personal items she knew would mean something to Paul. Old photographs from his successful ventures, books he'd mentioned fondly in letters, little mementos that rebuilt the bridge between past and present. It was during one of those conversations about shared memories that the subject of Paul's children arose again. "Richard and Elizabeth," Paul said, looking at an old photograph where two smiling kids stood beside him. "We were close when they were little. At some point, money became more important than connection." Anne sensed the pain behind his seemingly resigned words. "They still visit you at Alameda?" Paul laughed without humor. "Occasionally, scheduled visits, always in a hurry to leave, more of a duty than a desire." Anne carefully considered her next words. "Would you like to see them again? Maybe here, in a different setting?" Paul was silent so long that Anne wondered if he hadn't heard her. Finally, he spoke. "Richard, maybe. He at least calls the doctors to check on me. Elizabeth, she can barely look at me. Seeing her father aged seems like a personal affront to her." Anne nodded, an idea forming. A few days later, with Paul's permission, Anne contacted Richard Thompson. The conversation was short and formal. Richard clearly surprised that a nurse from Pineview was so involved in his father's case. "Mr. Thompson," Anne said at the end of the call, "your father is improving significantly here. I believe a visit would really help his continued progress." There was a pause on the other end. "He asked to see me?" "He mentioned missing you," Anne replied, softening the truth to open a door. Richard agreed to visit the following week, his voice reflecting a mix of reluctance and curiosity. Anne prepared Paul carefully for the meeting, not just physically making sure he was well dressed and comfortable, but emotionally. The goal is not confrontation, she advised gently. It's reconnection. Look for common ground, not differences. The meeting was set in the garden, where Paul felt most at ease. Anne stayed discreetly nearby, ready to intervene if needed but giving them space. Richard arrived promptly, wearing a suit that felt out of place in Pineview's casual setting. He paused for a moment when he saw his father sitting on a bench under the magnolia tree. Their initial conversation was tense and predictable. Polite questions about health, remarks about the weather, uncomfortable silences. Then something shifted. Paul showed Richard a book Anne had brought in, a first edition of The Little Prince he used to read to his children when they were small. "Do you remember this?" Paul asked, his fingers gently tracing the worn cover. "You always insisted on the chapter about the fox." An involuntary smile softened the tense lines of Richard's face. "You become responsible forever for what you have tamed," he quoted. "I think I finally understand what that means." From that point on, the conversation flowed more naturally. When Richard finally said goodbye, nearly 2 hours had passed, far longer than the usual 20 minutes Paul had described as the norm at Alameda. "What did you say to him?" Paul asked after his son left. "He seemed different." "I only told him the truth," Anne replied, "that you're getting better, and that you mentioned missing him." In the following weeks, Richard visited twice more, each visit more relaxed than the last. On the third visit, he brought his youngest son, Jacob, who spent a fascinating hour talking to Anne about geriatrics and neuroscience. "You're not just taking care of me," Paul said one evening while Anne helped him get ready for bed. "You're rebuilding my family." Anne smiled, adjusting his pillow. "I'm just creating opportunities. You're doing the real work." Early one October morning, a memo announced that renovations at Alameda were finished. The temporary residents would return the following week. Anne felt a tightness in her chest upon reading it. The past weeks had created a comfortable routine between her and Paul. The thought of him leaving, going back to that cold, impersonal place, was painful. "You could come with me," Paul suggested when she told him the news. "Alameda would pay you twice what you earn here." Anne smiled sadly. "My place is here, Paul. There are people here who need me, who don't have the resources for a place like Alameda." Paul nodded, understanding. It was exactly the answer he expected, proof that Anne still honored the promise she'd made so many years ago. "For you really kept your word, didn't you?" he said, looking at her with genuine admiration, "caring for the people nobody wants to care for." "I learned from the best," she replied softly. On the eve of the transfer, Paul asked to speak with his lawyer. Anne arranged the visit, staying away from the private meeting that lasted almost 2 hours. "May I ask what you discussed?" she inquired later, helping him with his nightly medications. "Unfinished business," Paul answered vaguely, but there was a newfound certainty in his gaze. Things that needed adjusting to reflect new realities. 3 weeks after Paul's return to Alameda, Anne got an unexpected phone call at her apartment. Richard Thompson's anxious voice came through the line. "Miss Lawson, we need to talk. It's about my father and certain decisions he recently made." His tone wasn't friendly. Anne felt a chill of apprehension. "Of course. When's convenient?" "Tomorrow, at his lawyer's office. There's something you need to explain." The next day, Anne arrived to find not only Richard but also Elizabeth Thompson in the elegant office of Mr. Harrington, Paul's longtime attorney. The atmosphere was tense, with the siblings sitting stiffly on one side of a conference table, the lawyer in the middle and Paul, surprisingly present, near the window. "Thank you for coming, Miss Lawson," Mr. Harrington said formally. "Mr. Thompson has requested your presence for this family discussion." Elizabeth, a middle-aged woman whose beauty had been maintained by expensive procedures, gave Anne a piercing look. "Let's get straight to the point," Richard interrupted. "Our father decided to change his will significantly." Anne looked at Paul, who remained calm, observing the scene with a serenity that contrasted with his children's obvious tension. "Mr. Thompson requested a complete review of his will 3 weeks ago," the lawyer explained. The changes have been legally registered and are now in effect. Changes that disinherit his own children in favor of... Elizabeth hesitated, giving Anne an assessing look. A nurse he's barely known. Anne felt as if lightning had struck her. She turned to Paul, stunned. "Paul, what did you do?" Paul finally spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "I did what I should have done a long time ago. I recognized who truly cares about me, not my money." Richard slammed his palm against the table. "This is absurd. We're your children, your family, and you're leaving everything, the company, the properties, the investments, to someone you met a few months ago." Paul gave a faint smile. "Actually, I've known Anne far longer than that." He looked directly at her. "Tell them." Reluctantly, Anne explained their story, the meeting at the orphanage, the letters exchanged for years, the schooling Paul had funded, the promise made by a 6-year-old girl who now cared for the man who had changed her life. She watched as the siblings' expressions shifted from initial scorn to confusion, and finally stunned silence. "You never asked about my letters," Paul said when Anne finished. "You never showed interest in what I did besides building the fortune you're so eager to inherit." Elizabeth stood, eyes glinting angrily. "This is manipulation." "She took advantage of you and your vulnerability." "For goodness sake, Elizabeth." Paul's voice carried the precision of the businessman who had built an empire. "I've been writing to Anne since she was 6. I moved to Alameda 2 years ago. How could she have planned this?" "It doesn't matter," Richard interjected, trying a more rational approach. "Dad, do you really want everything you worked for to go to a stranger? For the Thompson family legacy to end up in the hands of someone with no connection to us?" Anne stood slowly, her gaze steady. "Mr. Thompson, Richard, I never asked for this, and I don't want it." She turned to Paul, her eyes pleading. "Paul, please, don't do this." "I never intended to break up your family." Paul sighed deeply, as though decades of difficult decisions had finally settled on his shoulders. "Anne, my decision is not about punishing my children. It's about recognizing what legacy really means." He looked at Richard and Elizabeth. "A legacy isn't just financial assets. It's values, principles, and promises kept." He stood up with effort, declining assistance, and walked to the window. For a few moments, he just stared at the city below. "Look at her," he said, finally turning to face his children. "Anne could have stayed at St. Mary's, the best geriatric center in the country. Instead, she chose to work at Pineview, where she could help those who truly needed her. When she found me there, she could have revealed who she was right away, used our past connection for personal gain. Instead, she cared for me quietly, respecting my dignity." His voice grew softer, more reflective. "She kept the promise she made as a child. Have you kept yours? You promised visits that never happened, time you never found, attention you never paid." The office fell into heavy silence. Elizabeth lowered her head, the combative gleam in her eyes replaced by what might have been shame. Richard stared at his own hands, his face a controlled mask. "I'm not disinheriting you entirely," Paul continued. "Each of you will receive a substantial trust, but the majority of my estate, including control of the company, will go to the Invisible Scars Foundation, which Anne will manage." "Foundation?" Anne asked, puzzled. Paul smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, Anne saw in him a complete peace, as though he had finally found the answer he'd been seeking his whole life. A foundation to provide education and opportunities for vulnerable youth, especially those interested in caregiving professions. To create more Annes in the world. Silent tears streamed down Anne's cheeks as she grasped the magnitude of Paul's actions, not just acknowledging who she had become, but ensuring her story could be multiplied, opening doors for others who, like her, only needed a chance. "This is pure madness," Elizabeth muttered, but her voice no longer carried conviction. Richard remained silent for another few moments before finally speaking. "Dad, I may not agree with your decision, but I'm starting to understand your reasons." He hesitated, glancing briefly at Anne. "Jacob really liked her, you know. He said she explained neurological concepts better than his professors." A faint smile, almost imperceptible, crossed Paul's lips. "He's always been a bright boy." The rest of the meeting unfolded in more technical terms, explanations of the foundation's legal structure, the trusts for Richard and Elizabeth, the responsibilities Anne would assume. She absorbed it all in a state of stunned disbelief, unable to fully grasp what was happening. When it was over, the Thompson siblings left without farewells, each lost in their own tumultuous thoughts. The lawyer discreetly withdrew to another room, leaving Anne and Paul alone. "Why?" was all she could ask. Paul approached, taking her hands in his. "Because you showed me what truly matters, Anne. The true power of a promise. The invisible scars that shape us are not just our wounds but our commitments, what we promise to be, to do, to give." His eyes, aged by time, but illuminated by a renewed clarity, met hers. "My most important scar was the promise I made to a little girl in an orphanage. And look what she became, not just for me but for all those you care for." Anne felt the weight and lightness of that moment, a promise not just fulfilled but transformed into something that would outlast both of them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when no one else did." "And thank you," he replied softly, "for reminding me I am still seen, even when the world prefers to forget me." Outside the window, the autumn sun cast a golden light over the city, illuminating invisible scars connecting two souls through time. The billionaire and the orphan, the patient and the nurse, bound by a promise that had grown into a legacy. Winter arrived with unusual intensity, draping the city in a white mantle that muffled its usual clamor. Anne watched the snow fall outside the Alameda residence, where she now visited Paul 3 times a week, fitting it into her schedule at Pineview. The weeks following the will's revelation had been tense. Richard and Elizabeth seemed to accept Paul's decision, albeit reluctantly. Richard continued visiting, somewhat formally, and even Elizabeth stopped by once, briefly, bringing flowers but little conversation. "They're processing the situation," Paul commented, noticing Anne's thoughtful expression as she arranged the lilies she'd brought. "Give them time." Anne nodded but wasn't entirely convinced. The apparent calm felt more like the lull before a storm, not a genuine understanding. "I hope so. I never wanted to cause a family rift." Paul smiled, his eyes reflecting decades of wisdom from countless negotiations and conflicts. "Some cracks have to happen before true reconciliation," he said softly. "It's like breaking a poorly set bone so it can heal correctly." That afternoon, as Anne was about to leave Alameda, a staff member at the reception desk approached. "Miss Lawson, there are people waiting to speak with you in the private visitation room." Intrigued and slightly uneasy, Anne followed them to the elegantly furnished room reserved for confidential meetings. Opening the door, she found Richard and Elizabeth Thompson seated side by side, like a united front. A woman in a perfectly tailored suit, whom Anne didn't recognize, sat nearby with a folder of documents in her lap. "Anne," Richard said, standing and extending his hand in a formal greeting. "Thank you for meeting us without notice." Anne shook his hand, sensing the tension underneath his polite gesture. "I wasn't expecting you here today." "We preferred it this way," Elizabeth said without standing. A frank conversation, without our father present to influence the dialogue. Anne took a seat where indicated, keeping her posture straight and gaze calm, despite growing anxiety. "This is Vanessa Cooper, our attorney." Richard introduced the unfamiliar woman. "She's here just to ensure everything is handled properly." "Properly," Anne repeated, feeling the weight of the word. "I'm listening." Richard and Elizabeth exchanged a quick glance before he continued. "Anne, we'd like to propose an agreement. Something beneficial for everyone involved." "What sort of agreement?" The attorney slid a document across the coffee table. "An alternative arrangement for distributing Paul Thompson's assets," she explained clinically. "It would preserve the idea of the foundation but place it under joint administration with the Thompson family, along with a generous personal compensation for you." Anne looked at the document without touching it. "Compensation," she echoed, the word leaving a bitter taste. $1 million, Elizabeth stated bluntly. "Tax-free. More than enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life or to fund any personal project you desire." A silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of a piano in Alameda's main lounge. Anne drew a deep breath and organizing her thoughts. Do you think that's what I want? Money? Everyone wants money, Elizabeth replied with a dismissive shrug. The only difference is how much and what they're willing to do for it. Anne felt a wave of sadness, realizing how little Elizabeth truly understood, not just about her, but about her own father. I didn't approach your father to get anything, Anne said calmly. In fact, when I found him at Pineview, I hesitated to reveal who I was precisely, so he wouldn't think I wanted something. Richard leaned forward, adopting a more conciliatory tone. Anne, we understand the story you share with our father. It's touching, truly, but you must understand our perspective. This is the Thompson family legacy. The company was built over generations, 2 generations to be exact, Anne quietly corrected. Your father built it from the ground up, after inheriting a small store from his father. Richard's face reddened slightly. The point is, there's a natural expectation of family continuity. Like the expectation that you'd visit him regularly at Alameda, Anne asked, immediately regretting her sharper tone. Elizabeth slammed her hand on the table, losing her composure momentarily. Don't you dare judge us. You know nothing about our family, our history, our complications. You're right, Anne conceded, regaining her composure. I don't... Just as you seem to know very little about who your father really is, beyond his fortune. The attorney cleared her throat, trying to regain control. Perhaps we can return to the proposed agreement. It's a generous offer, Miss Lawson, and it would avoid potential legal complications in the future. Anne looked at her directly. You're suggesting you'd contest the will? We're suggesting there are many ways to interpret the actions of an elderly man who suffered an ischemic episode and later developed a sudden fixation on a much younger nurse, the lawyer said clinically. Anne felt like she'd been slapped. The insinuation was so far from the truth of her relationship with Paul that she was momentarily speechless. Sensing they'd gone too far, Richard spoke quickly. That's not what we're trying to imply, Anne. We know you genuinely care about our father. That's why we believe if you really care, you'd want to avoid a protracted legal fight that would only stress him in his fragile condition. Anne stood slowly, feeling within herself a strength she hadn't known she possessed, the same strength Paul had seen in her when she was just a quiet orphan. Let me be clear, she said, her voice calm but firm. I never asked your father for anything. I never expected more than the educational opportunities he generously gave me as a child. Finding him at Pineview was an accident of fate that neither of us planned. She paused, looking directly at the Thompsons. Your father's decision to change his will was entirely his own. I actually argued against it, worried about exactly this type of situation. Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but Anne continued, determined to finish her thought. What you don't seem to grasp is that this inheritance is not a prize I'm receiving. It's not a business transaction. It's recognition of a story of gratitude and quiet love that spans almost my entire life. She picked up her bag, preparing to leave. I'm not signing your agreement, not because I want the money, but because I deeply respect your father's decision. If you wish to contest it legally, that's your right. But don't try to manipulate me using Paul's well-being as an argument, not when I've spent more time with him in recent months than you have in years. Richard stood abruptly. You have no idea what you're talking about. We have careers, families, responsibilities. And your father wasn't one of those responsibilities? Anne asked, letting the question hang like a silent challenge. A heavy silence settled over the room. For a fleeting moment, Anne saw something in Elizabeth's eyes. Not anger, but a rare vulnerability, almost like recognition. I'm going to visit your father now, Anne finally said, heading to the door. Feel free to join me. He would be glad to see you. Richard glanced at the attorney, who began collecting her documents with discreet efficiency. We're not done discussing this, Anne, he warned. There's a lot at stake here. Anne paused at the door, turning back one last time. Yes, there is a lot at stake. The dignity of a man who built an empire yet never found anyone who valued his heart more than his achievements. A man who's now trying to ensure his true legacy survives, not just in financial assets, but in values and principles. With those words, she left, feeling her legs tremble slightly as she walked down the hall. Courage has a physical cost, she thought. Entering Paul's room, she found him by the window, watching the snow fall. "You look upset," he remarked, ever observant. Anne hesitated, wondering whether to share the encounter with his children. She chose honesty. They had always been truthful with each other. "Your children were waiting for me with a lawyer." Paul didn't seem surprised. "Let me guess, they offered money for you to renounce control of the foundation?" Anne nodded, sitting beside him. $1 million. Paul gave a small smile. "They've always been conservative in their initial negotiations." He took her hand and squeezed gently. "What did you tell them?" "That I never asked for anything. That this inheritance isn't a prize but a recognition of our shared history." Paul nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "They'll come around eventually, or not. But it doesn't change the truth of what we're doing." Anne looked at their joined hands, one wrinkled by time, the other young but equally resolute. "I don't want to be the cause of a permanent break in your family." "You're not the cause, Anne," Paul replied gently. "You're just the mirror reflecting truths they're not ready to face. And sometimes the reflection is more frightening than the object itself." Outside, the snow continued to fall silently, blanketing the city in a white veil that, for a few hours, would hide its flaws. But underneath, Anne thought, the real scars remained, invisible, deep, defining, and perhaps, one day, healing. Spring arrived in a burst of color after the long winter. In the garden of Alameda residence, the cherry trees blossomed in pink clouds, creating an ethereal canopy over the carefully tended pathways. Sitting in his custom wheelchair, a recent gift from Anne, Paul watched birds flit among the blooming branches. 18 months had passed since the will was changed. After the initial confrontation, a fragile truce developed between Paul's children and Anne. It wasn't friendship or full acceptance, but a type of reluctant respect that allowed them to share the same space without open hostility. The threatened legal battle Richard and Elizabeth had hinted at never fully materialized. Perhaps Anne's quiet determination had made them reconsider. Or maybe, as Paul suspected, they had finally realized contesting their father's final major decision would only confirm his assessment of their priorities. "There you are," Anne's voice broke through his thoughts. She approached, pushing a cart with tea and cookies. "Skipping physical therapy again?" Paul smiled, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Negotiating alternative terms," he said with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I told Mr. Rivera I'd complete the exercises this afternoon if I could spend the morning out here." Anne shook her head, amused. Even at 85, weakened by time and frail health, Paul still had the negotiating skills that had built his empire. "I have news," she said, pouring tea just the way he liked, chamomile with a touch of honey. "The board approved all the candidates we selected, 10 full scholarships for the coming academic year." Genuine satisfaction lit Paul's features. "Tell me about them." Anne took a seat beside him, her face animated as she described the project that had become the heart of their shared efforts in recent months, the Invisible Scars Foundation. "Miguel is 17, grew up in foster care since he was 8, wants to study pediatric nursing, writes poetry in his spare time. Sophia is 19, helped raise 4 younger siblings while her mother worked 2 jobs, dreams of becoming an occupational therapist for children with disabilities." She continued outlining each young candidate, their stories, their dreams, their struggles. Paul listened intently, occasionally asking precise questions about each applicant's circumstances, always attentive to details that revealed character and drive. Officially started only 6 months ago, the Invisible Scars Foundation was rooted in that very first conversation in the orphanage library, when a man saw potential in a quiet girl reading about dragons. Its mission was simple and profound: to identify vulnerable youth with a genuine calling for caregiving professions, offering them not just full financial support, but mentorship, internships, and ongoing guidance throughout their training. "Sarah reminds me of you," Paul said after Anne described one particularly introspective candidate. "That same quietness hiding fierce determination." Anne smiled, touched by the comparison. She wrote in her essay that she wants to be the person who notices those nobody else notices. It's almost like she heard our conversation in that orphanage library. That's how legacies work, Paul replied softly. Words echo across generations, even when the original source is forgotten. They sat in silence for a few moments, enjoying the tea and the serene beauty of the garden. The foundation had become their joint project, something that transcended their initial roles of benefactor and beneficiary, uniting them as partners on a shared mission. Richard called this morning, Paul said casually, though Anne sensed the importance behind it. Jacob got accepted into med school. That's wonderful, Anne answered earnestly. He's naturally gifted. When we talked about neuroscience during that visit, I was impressed by how intuitively he understood it. Pride flickered in Paul's eyes. Richard asked if the foundation might offer Jacob a summer internship in our geriatric care research program. Anne raised her eyebrows, genuinely surprised. That's unexpected. Another scar beginning to heal, Paul observed. Richard is, in his own way, extending an olive branch. Progress with Elizabeth was slower. Her occasional visits remained formal and brief, more duty than genuine interest. But there was a small improvement, even addressing Anne by name now instead of the nurse, occasionally asking about the foundation with a superficial curiosity. The headquarters grand opening is set for next month, Anne changed the subject, checking notes on her tablet. The mayor confirmed attendance, and 3 major newspapers will send reporters. The new headquarters of the Invisible Scars Foundation was housed in a restored historic building downtown, once a small branch office of Thompson Enterprises, now transformed into a welcoming space with classrooms, a library, labs, and communal areas. The symbolism of that transformation wasn't lost on anyone. "Are you sure you want to attend?" Anne asked, watching Paul carefully. In recent months, his mobility had declined noticeably, turning every outing into a logistical and physical challenge. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," he replied firmly. "I want to see our legacy come to life while I still can." Anne heard the subtext. Both knew Paul's time was limited. The doctors had been transparent about his progressively weakening heart. "Then we'll be there," she affirmed, gently squeezing his hand. Together. The following weeks were filled with final preparations for the grand opening. Anne divided her time between administrative foundation duties, visits to Alameda to see Paul, and her reduced but ongoing shifts at Pineview Care Home. She refused to give up direct caregiving, despite her new responsibilities. "It keeps me grounded in reality," she explained when Paul suggested she might focus exclusively on the foundation. "I need my hands in real care, not just administration." The day of the opening dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze that felt like a good omen. Anne arrived early at Alameda to help Paul prepare. She found him already up, dressed in a navy blue suit tailored to accommodate his frailer body without sacrificing elegance. "You look dashing," she commented, adjusting his tie slightly. "Important occasions demand proper effort," he responded with a smile. The event was an overwhelming success. The restored building gleamed under the spring sun, its tall windows reflecting light like promises of a bright future. Paul and Sarah, the quiet applicant who reminded him of Anne, cut the inaugural ribbon together, symbolizing the bridge between generations. In his brief speech, Paul surprised everyone with a strength that belied his physical frailty. "Invisible scars are not just marks of our wounds," he said, his voice strong and clear. "They're lines of force showing our capacity to heal, to transform. We all carry scars, but some of us learn to turn them into bridges for those still bleeding." He looked directly at Anne, standing a few steps behind him. This foundation was born from a promise made by a 6-year-old girl who vowed to care for the people no one else wanted to care for. Today, we see that promise expanded, multiplied, becoming a legacy that will outlive us all. During the reception, Anne watched with quiet satisfaction as Paul interacted with the foundation's first scholarship recipients. There was something profoundly right about the image. An elderly man surrounded by hopeful, energetic youths, all connected by an intuitive understanding of the value of genuine care. In a welcome surprise, Richard attended, bringing Jacob. Elizabeth sent flowers and a brief, polite note regretting her absence due to prior engagements. Small steps, Anne thought. Small scars slowly healing. The return trip to Alameda in the late afternoon was quiet. Paul was visibly tired, but his eyes shone with the contentment of someone who had witnessed something truly important come to fruition. In the days that followed, he rested more than usual, saving his energy while he took in the meaning of what they had accomplished. Anne carried on with their established routine, dividing her time between the foundation and her regular visits to Paul. One afternoon, 2 weeks after the inauguration, Anne arrived at Alameda to find Paul quieter than normal. Not the silence of exhaustion or illness, but something more contemplative, almost serene. "Shall we go to the garden?" he suggested after they exchanged their usual updates. Anne looked out the window. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting it with early shades of pinkish dusk. "Sure, it's a perfect afternoon." She wheeled him through the polished corridors of Alameda to the garden, where they found a quiet spot under a blooming cherry tree. The air smelled sweet, and the golden light of late day softened all edges. For a long time they sat side by side in silence, watching day turn into evening. It was not an empty silence, but a full one, filled with their shared history, with a journey that began with a chance meeting in an orphanage library, and now extended to dozens of lives touched by the foundation. "Do you know what I'm thinking?" Paul finally asked, his voice as soft as the gathering twilight. "What? How life is circular, not linear like we imagine when we're young." Anne nodded, understanding intuitively. "We started in different places, you with privilege, me with nothing. Yet here we are, side by side, watching the same sunset." Paul smiled, reaching for her hand. "More than that, the little girl who promised to care for those nobody wanted grew up and now takes care of the man who once saw her potential. And together, we've created a path for others to follow the same cycle." "Invisible scars," Anne whispered. "Exactly. The marks that shape us, connect us, make us who we are." The sun touched the horizon, spreading gold and crimson across the sky. Soon, the first stars would appear, beginning their silent vigil. "I'm at peace, Anne," Paul said after another long silence. "With my choices. With my legacy." She gently squeezed his hand, feeling the fragile yet steady pulse beneath her fingers. "Me too." In that moment, as day dissolved into night, both understood they had achieved something rare and precious, a perfect circle. A promise not just fulfilled but transformed into something far greater than themselves. The journey that began with a reclusive billionaire noticing a solitary orphan girl did not end with the inevitable separation time would bring. It continued through the lives of the Foundation's young scholars, through future generations touched by it, through the countless people who would receive care from those who learned to transform their own scars into healing for others. The circle did not close with loss, but with a new beginning. A story that would go on silent and strong, like the invisible scars we all carry, not merely wounds, but witnesses to our capacity for transformation and healing. The first stars glimmered in the velvet sky. Anne and Paul stayed there side by side, watching nightfall. No more words were needed. The promise had been made. The promise had been kept. And now, transformed, it would endure long after them. As with all the truest stories, this one did not end with a period, but opened into ellipses, a pause for breath before new voices continued the narrative, before new hearts carried the promise forward, before new hands reached out to those most in need. The invisible scars that bound a billionaire and an orphan now stretched out like a delicate yet strong web, touching lives they would never personally know, but who would carry forward the legacy of a simple promise made by a 6-year-old girl. "I want to care for the people nobody wants to care for." And so the story went on, silent and strong, like all invisible scars that define us, connect us, and ultimately transcend us. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like, because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.